They were Hollywood royalty in every sense. Rob Reiner, an icon of comedy and cinema, had a life most people could only dream of: awards, fame, adoring fans, and a marriage that seemed strong on paper. Michelle, his wife, a figure of grace and warmth, stood by him as a partner, confidant, an anchor in a world known for its unpredictability. Together, they built not just a family, but a sanctuary in the heart of Brentwood, a sprawling $13.5 million estate that looked, from the outside, like the perfect picture of affluence and domestic bliss. But appearances can be deceiving. Imagine walking into that home on a sunny Sunday morning. Birds chirping, sunlight dancing on the polished floors, the laughter of friends and family echoing through the halls. You'd see a loving couple, an adult son living nearby in a guest house, and perhaps think that everything was normal, safe, secure. But beneath that veneer, something was festering. Something no one wanted to see until it was too late. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Rob had friends who cared deeply for him. Among them, a man who knew Hollywood, knew its secrets, but more importantly, knew Rob as a friend, Billy Crystal. A confidant, a trusted voice, someone whose words could pierce through even the most glittering facades. Just 1 week before tragedy struck, Billy had pulled Rob aside and spoken words that would, in hindsight, feel chillingly prophetic. He said, "Your son has a dark obsession with you. Watch your back." It's the kind of warning most of us think we'd act on immediately. And yet, as human nature tends to do, disbelief crept in. Denial. Rationalization. A son couldn't possibly harbor that kind of darkness toward his own parents, could he? And yet, here we are. On that Sunday night, Rob, 78, and Michelle, 70, were found brutally murdered, stabbed inside their own home. The shocking culprit? Nick, their 32-year-old son, living just steps away in the guest house. Arrested the very same night and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, he now sits at the center of a story so twisted that Hollywood itself seems incapable of digesting it fully. But how did things get to this point? How does a family, seemingly close, loving, and secure, implode in a way that leaves the world stunned? To understand, we must start at the beginning, at the life they built, the warning signs that went unnoticed, and the shadows that crept in behind closed doors. Because this story is not just about tragedy, it is about obsession, warning, betrayal, and the painful realization that sometimes the people we trust the most can harbor the darkest secrets. Even before Billy Crystal's warning, there were signs. Small, almost invisible to anyone outside the family, but to those who knew Nick, they were glaring. Reports of him talking to himself in the dark, episodes of intense anger, or moments of eerie silence where he seemed lost in thought. Objects in the house slightly out of place, subtle tensions in conversations, a glance from Nick that made people uneasy without knowing why. The Reiner family, like many families, had the challenge of navigating love with caution. They wanted to believe the best in their son, to give him space and freedom. But sometimes love itself can blind. How often do we ignore the shadows in our loved one's eyes, convincing ourselves that we are overreacting? Rob Reiner, despite his accomplishments and worldly experience, was human. Michelle, nurturing and gentle, wanted harmony. They were ill-prepared for the storm that was brewing under their very roof. Billy Crystal's warning was not casual. It carried weight, history, and urgency. Imagine the tension of hearing a close friend, someone you trust implicitly, look you in the eyes and say something so dire. Watch your back. Words that, in hindsight, resonate with haunting clarity. What could Rob have done differently? Could anyone have intervened in time? These questions will linger throughout this story. And as we explore them, you will begin to understand the full depth of a tragedy that Hollywood, and the world, will not soon forget. Now, consider the emotional complexity of this family dynamic. On one hand, a renowned father and mother who had navigated fame, fortune, and public scrutiny for decades. On the other hand, a son who, to most, seemed normal but carried a hidden intensity that would explode in the most unthinkable way. Family members, friends, neighbors. They all had interactions, but none could piece together the full mosaic of what was happening. And there is another dimension. The eerie coincidence that these events unfolded in a place meant to protect and shelter. The Brentwood estate, the very definition of luxury and safety, became the scene of horror. A home that once echoed with laughter now whispers with shadows. The irony is cruel. The son lived nearby, not hidden away, but within arm's reach. Proximity made the betrayal more palpable, more shocking. From a psychological perspective, the warning signs of obsession and rage are often subtle. They manifest in patterns most dismiss as quirks or temporary behaviors. But when combined with isolation, mental instability, and suppressed resentment, these signs can morph into violent action. Billy Crystal sensed something profoundly wrong. He saw the potential danger, the darkness that had perhaps gone unnoticed even by the parents themselves. And so he warned Rob. He pleaded with his friend. And yet, even his words, urgent and terrifying, could not prevent what was about to happen. The story of Rob and Michelle Reiner's last week on this earth is a lesson in the fragility of trust, the complexity of familial love, and the devastating consequences of ignoring or underestimating the warning signs. It is a story that will take us from the heights of Hollywood glamour to the depths of personal tragedy, from whispered fears to violent reality. And at its center is a haunting question. How could someone so close, someone they loved unconditionally, turn into a threat that would destroy their world in one night? Before we delve into the chapters that follow, imagine yourself in their shoes for a moment. Picture the joy of a family gathering. Hear the laughter echoing through the hallways. Feel the warmth of security and love. And then, picture that world shattering. Picture betrayal and violence entering a home where you thought you were safe. That contrast, the light of life against the dark shadow of tragedy, is what makes this story both heartbreaking and compelling. And yet, despite the horror, there is a story to uncover. A story of warning signs, of advice from a friend who tried to intervene, of the subtle and terrifying buildup that no one outside the family fully grasped. We will explore every angle, every detail, every emotional spike. You will hear about the parents' lives, their joys, their fears, and their interactions with Nick. You will learn about the weeks leading up to the event, the friends who noticed oddities, and the haunting words of Billy Crystal, whose warning now echoes through time. This is not a story to be digested casually. It is meant to be felt, questioned, and understood. And as you listen, you will ask yourself uncomfortable questions. How well do we truly know our loved ones? Could we recognize darkness if it existed in someone we adore? Could a single warning have changed everything? They say that in Hollywood, appearances are everything. And for Rob Reiner and Michelle, the life they projected to the world was nothing short of enviable. From award shows to magazine covers, from movie sets to glamorous parties, their names carried weight, respect, and admiration. Yet behind the smiles, the laughter, and the flashing cameras, a quieter, more complex life unfolded, a life that, to anyone outside the family, seemed flawless. But perfection, as it often does, has a fragile side. Rob Reiner, 78, was more than just a celebrity. He was a legend of American cinema, a man whose work had influenced generations. Movies like This Is Spinal Tap and When Harry Met Sally weren't just films, they were cultural milestones. Yet beyond the accolades, Rob was a husband, a father, a man who cared deeply for his family and the people he loved. Michelle, 70, stood beside him not only as a spouse, but as the stabilizing force that balanced his larger-than-life personality. Their love, by most accounts, was deep, genuine, and unwavering. But even the strongest bonds can hide fractures, and the Reiner story was about to expose cracks that no one could have foreseen. Their home in Brentwood was the epitome of luxury. A sprawling $13.5 million estate, it had all the trappings of success. Manicured gardens, state-of-the-art kitchens, sunlit living spaces, and a guest house that housed their adult son, Nick. For years, neighbors admired the elegant architecture, the carefully curated landscaping, and the aura of warmth that seemed to radiate from the estate. Inside, the house was filled with laughter, shared meals, and the familiar rhythm of a family who had built a life together. But even in this sanctuary, shadows lurked, quiet, subtle, and nearly invisible. Nick, 32, lived in the guest house on the property. To the casual observer, he was an ordinary young man, enjoying the perks of his parents' success while carving out his own path. But those closest to the family sometimes noticed small oddities, moments when Nick seemed detached, moments when he spoke to himself, moments when his gaze lingered a little too long, a little too intensely. These observations were rare, scattered, and easy to dismiss. In a home filled with love and trust, no one wanted to see danger where they believed only safety existed. Hollywood life, for all its glamour, has a way of magnifying the ordinary. The Reiners were public figures, yet they also had private lives, filled with everyday struggles, joys, and conflicts. They attended premieres and parties, yes, but they also shared quiet dinners, vacations, and moments of intimacy away from the cameras. The dichotomy of public success and private vulnerability created a tension that few outsiders could truly understand. In this tension, seeds of concern often go unnoticed, and subtle signs can be misinterpreted or ignored entirely. Friends and colleagues of the Reiners described the couple as kind, approachable, and deeply loyal. They were people you could trust, people who valued relationships over reputation. But even the most perceptive friends cannot always penetrate the walls of a home, cannot always see the private moments where strain simmers unnoticed. And in the Reiners' case, there were moments, fleeting, small, that hinted at deeper issues. Billy Crystal, a lifelong friend of Rob's, was one of the few people who saw the potential for danger. His relationship with Rob spanned decades, built on trust, shared experiences, and mutual respect. Crystal noticed patterns, behaviors, and a sense of unease that most people would dismiss. He had warned Rob, cautiously but urgently, that Nick's obsession with him was more than mere admiration or attention. It was something darker, more dangerous. "Watch your back," he had said. The words, meant to jolt Rob into awareness, lingered like a shadow over the family, even if their significance wasn't fully grasped at the time. The truth is, warning signs are often subtle. They appear in moments of tension, in repeated patterns of behavior, in fleeting glances, or unspoken words. For the Reiners, these signs existed, but they were cloaked by love, by routine, by the belief that family is inherently safe. Parents want to believe in the goodness of their children. It is instinctual, unshakable. And yet, instinct alone cannot always protect against the unseen, the unforeseen, the unthinkable. Even within the Brentwood estate, the dynamics were complex. Nick's presence in the guest house created a proximity that was both comforting and fraught. On one hand, he was nearby, part of the family fabric, engaged in his own life. On the other hand, proximity allowed tensions to fester in ways that might have been mitigated by distance. Small disagreements, subtle power struggles, or unspoken resentments could intensify when a son lives just steps away. These are the invisible pressures that sometimes explode without warning. To understand the tragedy that would soon unfold, we must consider the human elements, the emotions, the fears, the blind spots. Rob and Michelle were not naive. They had navigated decades of challenges, both personal and professional. But even the most experienced, the most careful, cannot always anticipate the intensity of a storm brewing within the heart of someone they love. And when the storm arrives, it often strikes with sudden, overwhelming force. As we step closer to the night that changed everything, imagine the scene. The Reiner estate bathed in the soft glow of evening. Dinner has concluded, laughter echoes faintly in the hallways, and a sense of calm blankets the home. Outside, the Brentwood streets remain quiet, the kind of serene night that promises safety. Inside, though, small currents of unease ripple unseen. A glance exchanged, a whispered word, a moment of silence that feels heavier than it should. These are the moments that rarely make headlines. They are the precursor to tragedy, the subtle indicators that something is amiss. And for the Reiners, these indicators would soon be impossible to ignore. For all the love, all the trust, all the history they shared, the dark obsession Billy Crystal had warned about was moving closer to its inevitable conclusion. Hollywood had always been a world of spectacle, drama, and performance. But no movie, no script, no storyline could have prepared anyone for what would happen in the Reiner home that night. The very walls that held memories of joy, laughter, and family milestones would witness a horror that would shock the world. The contrast between public adoration and private terror would make this story resonate far beyond the confines of Brentwood, becoming a cautionary tale about love, trust, and the invisible dangers that can lurk in the heart of a family. And yet, even as the night approached, there was a lingering belief that everything would remain normal. The Reiners had faced challenges before, they had managed crises, and they had survived the ups and downs of life in the spotlight. But no amount of experience, no level of fame, could shield them from what was about to happen. The events leading up to that fateful Sunday night were filled with tension, hints, and warnings. There were moments that, in retrospect, seem obvious. But in real time, they were easy to dismiss, easy to rationalize, and easy to ignore. It is in these overlooked moments that tragedy often finds its opening. As we prepare to explore the next chapter, the hidden complexities of Nick Reiner, the son whose presence would ultimately shatter a family, we must hold on to the image of that perfect Hollywood life. The laughter, the luxury, the love, all of it was real. But underneath, there were currents of darkness that would soon rise, unstoppable, undeniable, and devastating. The question now is simple. How could a son, nurtured, loved, and supported, harbor a darkness so deep that it would destroy everything he was supposed to protect? And what signs, however subtle, were present that could have warned the Reiners before it was too late? From the outside, Nick Reiner appeared to be just another young man in Hollywood's orbit. Someone living in the shadow of famous parents, navigating life in a world filled with wealth, opportunity, and expectation. But appearances, as this story painfully proves, can be deceiving. Beneath the surface, Nick carried a complexity that few could fully comprehend, a darkness that would, in time, reveal itself in the most shocking and tragic way imaginable. Nick was 32 years old at the time of the tragedy. On paper, he seemed like a normal adult, capable of maintaining relationships, pursuing interests, and engaging with the world. To the casual observer, he was simply Rob and Michelle Reiner's son, a young man in the guest house of a luxurious Brentwood estate, enjoying the privileges of a comfortable life, yet distant enough to maintain some independence. But those who interacted with him more closely noticed peculiarities, small deviations from the norm that hinted at a mind wrestling with inner turmoil. Friends who spent time with Nick recalled moments of brilliance interspersed with unsettling behaviors. On some occasions, he would engage in intelligent, thoughtful conversation, demonstrating wit and insight. On others, he would retreat into himself, muttering to no one in particular, pacing the room as though arguing with an invisible opponent. Family members sometimes noticed the intensity of his gaze, the way it lingered too long, as if he were analyzing people not for connection, but for control, for assessment, for reasons no one else could see. Psychologists often say that obsession begins as fascination. In Nick's case, this fascination was directed outward, yet paradoxically inward as well. It was a fixation on relationships, authority, and perhaps most disturbingly, on his parents themselves. Reports from acquaintances indicate that he often spoke about his father in ways that veered from admiration into unease. Admiration so intense that it bordered on envy, and unease because he could not reconcile his own desires and frustrations with reality. Such behaviors, while subtle, are classic early warning signs of someone grappling with obsession. Nick's upbringing, although materially privileged, may have contributed to the complexity of his psyche. Being the child of celebrities brings unique pressures, the need to live up to expectations, the constant comparison to one's parents, and the exposure to a world where public perception often outweighs private reality. Even with love, guidance, and support, children of fame sometimes develop coping mechanisms that appear eccentric, odd, or socially withdrawn. In Nick's case, these mechanisms were intensified by behaviors that grew increasingly alarming over time. Neighbors occasionally reported seeing Nick wandering the grounds at odd hours, talking to himself, or engaging in strange routines that seemed obsessive in nature. These observations, while isolated, paint a portrait of a man whose inner life was becoming increasingly disconnected from the ordinary rhythms of daily life. For most people, such behaviors might have been dismissed as quirks of a young man living with autonomy. But when combined with other subtle signs, intensity, isolation, and a fixation on family dynamics, the picture becomes more troubling. It's crucial to understand that Nick was not an outsider. He was deeply embedded in his parents' lives, yet separate enough to create a bubble of isolation within the very home meant to shelter him. Living in the guest house, he was close enough to witness family routines, to interact with his parents daily, yet removed enough that his own obsessions could fester away from immediate scrutiny. This proximity created a dangerous dynamic. He could monitor, manipulate, and internalize grievances without constant oversight. Billy Crystal, Rob's close friend, had observed aspects of Nick's behavior that the family might have dismissed. In his warning to Rob, Crystal mentioned the intensity of Nick's obsession, a level of preoccupation with his father that suggested more than youthful angst or sibling rivalry. It was a premonition that something dark was brewing, a concern rooted in years of observation, intuition, and personal knowledge of both father and son. Crystal's words, delivered earnestly and urgently. Nick's relationships outside the family were limited. Friends described him as charming in brief interactions, yet difficult to sustain long-term connections. Social cues, subtle communication, and boundaries, things most of us take for granted, seemed, at times, to elude him. This isolation, combined with the intensity of his fixation on his parents, created a psychological pressure cooker. Emotions that might have been manageable in the context of healthy social networks became amplified and distorted within the confined space of family dynamics. Even within the family, tension existed, though it may have been subtle enough to escape notice. Small arguments, passive-aggressive interactions, and unexplained irritations were peppered throughout daily life. These conflicts, while not alarming on their own, reflected an underlying volatility that would later escalate to catastrophic consequences. Nick's ability to mask his darker impulses until they reached a point of eruption made him particularly unpredictable, a quality that even those closest to him could not fully comprehend. It's important to contextualize Nick's behavior in the larger framework of familial relationships. Obsession within a family context is uniquely potent because it combines love, dependence, and familiarity with control, frustration, and sometimes resentment. In Nick's case, the blend of admiration for his father and simmering anger or dissatisfaction created a volatile emotional state. Combined with access to the home and proximity to his parents, the stage was set for tragedy. As we examine Nick's life more closely, the question emerges: could anyone have predicted this outcome? Were the warning signs so subtle that even concerned friends missed them, or were they clear to those who knew what to look for? Billy Crystal believed he saw the danger. He spoke out, he warned, and he urged caution. But the human tendency to rationalize, to believe in the goodness of our loved ones, is powerful. Even when confronted with unsettling patterns, the mind often seeks reassurance rather than confrontation. Nick's history also includes moments that, in hindsight, seem more than coincidental. Small conflicts, unexplained absences, and behaviors that struck friends and family as odd, all contributed to a mosaic of concern that, unfortunately, would only gain clarity after tragedy struck. It's a haunting realization that patterns exist, and yet we often fail to recognize their significance until it is far too late. The hidden complexity of Nick Reiner. His obsessions, his isolation, his proximity to those he loved most, was a ticking time bomb. And for Rob and Michelle, the awareness that something was wrong was present but not fully actionable. Love, loyalty, and hope that their son would overcome his inner struggles blinded them to the possibility that he could become a lethal threat. This chapter of Nick's life is crucial to understanding the events that followed. It is here that the seeds of tragedy were sown, nurtured in the shadow of wealth and privilege, and intensified by human complexity. To grasp the full scope of what happened, we must see not just the actions, but the patterns, the psychology, and the subtle signals that foretold danger. And yet, even as Nick's behaviors grew more intense, there remained a sense of normalcy, a belief that the family could manage, could cope, could protect themselves through love alone. This belief, tragically, was the very thing that left them vulnerable. Because while love is powerful, it cannot always shield us from obsession. And while parents may wish to believe in the inherent goodness of their children, reality sometimes defies hope. In the next chapter, we will examine the moment that crystallized the warning, a moment when Billy Crystal, a friend and observer, spoke words that would reverberate through time. Words that carried urgency, insight, and a stark reminder. Even the people we love most can harbor darkness. And what came next, the events leading directly to tragedy, would leave everyone questioning how a family so loved, so admired, could be brought to ruin. Imagine this, a quiet afternoon, sunlight spilling across the Los Angeles streets, laughter of distant children echoing somewhere beyond the gates of the Brentwood estate. Rob Reiner, ever the consummate father and Hollywood icon, is meeting with one of his oldest and closest friends, Billy Crystal. They've shared decades together, film sets, award shows, private conversations, even vacations. Trust runs deep between them, built on years of honesty, camaraderie, and a shared understanding of the pressures of life under the spotlight. And yet, in that seemingly ordinary meeting, Billy leans in, and his words slice through the usual humor and casual chatter with a chilling intensity. Rob, your son has a dark obsession with you. Watch your back. To hear such a statement from a friend is jarring, even for someone as seasoned as Rob, a man who has directed, acted, and navigated the turbulent waters of Hollywood. This warning carries weight. Billy Crystal is not prone to exaggeration. His career, his life, his friendships are built on authenticity and keen observation. And when he speaks with this level of urgency, it is impossible to dismiss casually. Yet, human nature is strange. We want to believe, to rationalize, to protect our emotional core from uncomfortable truths. Rob heard the words. He understood their gravity. But could he have truly grasped the storm that was already forming in his own home? Billy's warning was born out of observation, intuition, and concern. He had noticed behaviors in Nick that most would have ignored as quirks of youth or eccentricities born of a sheltered Hollywood upbringing. Perhaps it was the way Nick would linger in conversations, subtly steering topics toward his father's actions or decisions. Perhaps it was the intensity in his eyes, the almost imperceptible signs of envy or resentment when discussing Rob's accomplishments or accolades. Or perhaps it was simply the gut feeling that friends sometimes get. A sense that something is dangerously off balance. Whatever the source, Billy's insight was clear. Nick's fixation on Rob was no ordinary admiration. It carried a weight, a darkness, a potential for harm that could not be ignored. Consider the psychological complexity here. Obsession, especially toward a parent, is rare but not unheard of. It can stem from feelings of inadequacy, jealousy, unresolved childhood tensions, or a combination of these factors. In Nick's case, it manifested subtly at first. Comments that seemed slightly controlling, behaviors that hinted at a need for dominance or attention, and a fixation on his parents that went beyond normal familial concern. To outsiders, these behaviors might appear minor or easily dismissible. But to someone attuned to human behavior, like Billy Crystal, the patterns were impossible to ignore. It is also worth noting the timing of the warning. Just 1 week before the catastrophic events that would forever alter the Reiners' lives, Billy felt compelled to speak up. This was not a passing comment, a casual remark, or idle speculation. It was a deliberate, urgent intervention, born of deep concern. The proximity of the warning to the tragedy adds a layer of haunting inevitability. It forces us to ask, could action have been taken? Could intervention have prevented what was about to occur? Or was this warning the last thread of hope before the storm? Rob's reaction, as described by those close to him, was a mixture of disbelief, concern, and protective instinct. How does a parent respond to such a warning? On one hand, there is trust in the judgment of a close friend. On the other, there is the instinct to shield one's child from scrutiny or judgment. And then there is love. The unshakable, often blinding force that makes it nearly impossible to consider that someone you raised could pose a genuine threat. Rob grappled with all of these emotions, trying to reconcile his love for Nick with the alarming insights delivered by Billy. Billy's warning also illuminates the complexity of human relationships, particularly among families living under intense public scrutiny. Hollywood families are often subject to pressures and distortions that ordinary families do not experience. Expectations, comparisons, and the constant public eye can exacerbate underlying tensions. For Nick, growing up with parents of fame and influence may have amplified feelings of inadequacy or jealousy. For Rob and Michelle, the desire to nurture, protect, and believe in their son may have created blind spots. Moments where they interpreted signs of obsession as mere quirks or developmental phases. But warnings, no matter how clear, rely on recognition and action to have impact. Billy Crystal's words, though precise and dire, could only do so much. They were a signal, an attempt to break through denial, a plea to acknowledge the danger that few wanted to see. And yet, in that delicate balance between love, trust, and fear, even the most well-intentioned interventions can falter. This moment also reveals the paradox of human intuition versus evidence. Billy's insight was based not on legal facts or external confirmation, but on instinct, observation, and experience with both father and son. It is a reminder that sometimes the most urgent warnings come not from experts, but from friends who see patterns invisible to those enmeshed in daily life. Yet intuition, without corroborating evidence, can feel abstract, even improbable. And in families, especially those bound by love, improbable warnings are often sidelined. As we reflect on this warning, consider the emotional tension it creates. Billy, aware of the risk, feels compelled to speak. Rob, loving his son and trusting his friend, listens but cannot fully internalize the magnitude of the danger. Michelle, likely aware of subtle cues herself, may have sensed unease but relied on the stability of the household and the bond with her son to navigate concerns. This convergence of awareness, partial perception, and denial creates a precarious situation, a perfect storm waiting to unfold. Billy Crystal's warning also speaks to a larger theme: the difficulty of recognizing danger within one's closest relationships. We are often blindest to threats that originate from those we love. Trust, attachment, and emotional bonds can cloud judgment, delaying recognition until patterns have solidified into undeniable reality. In the Reiner household, this dynamic was tragically pronounced. A close friend saw the danger. A parent tried to reconcile love with caution, and a son, quietly obsessive, was already moving toward the precipice of violence. In the days following the warning, subtle shifts in family behavior may have occurred. Perhaps there were attempts to monitor Nick, casual inquiries about his moods, or discussions about boundaries. Perhaps the family's routine remained unchanged, the belief in normalcy outweighing fear. These small, human responses reflect both the limitations of foresight and the universal struggle to confront uncomfortable truths. Billy Crystal's intervention also resonates with the audience on a deeper emotional level. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that warnings, even from those we trust most, can be insufficient when faced with human complexity, obsession, and mental instability. It challenges us to consider our own relationships. Are we listening to the voices that caution us? Are we interpreting subtle signs accurately, or are we dismissing them because they disrupt our sense of normalcy? The significance of the warning becomes even more chilling when viewed in hindsight. 1 week later, Rob and Michelle Reiner would be found stabbed to death, their son arrested at the scene. The words, "Watch your back," echo with prophetic weight, a haunting reminder that insight without intervention cannot always prevent tragedy. Billy Crystal's warning, urgent and heartfelt, stands as both a testament to his loyalty and a stark illustration of the limits of human action in the face of hidden darkness. This chapter of the story sets the stage for what comes next. It is the moment where foresight collides with fate, where observation clashes with denial, and where a family's life teeters on the edge of irreversible tragedy. The warning is clear, but the response is complicated. And as we move into the unfolding events leading directly to the fatal night, we will see how the intersection of obsession, proximity, and human complexity transformed a desperate caution into an unheeded prophecy. Small tensions often go unnoticed. A quiet sigh, a glance that lingers too long, a word spoken under the breath. These are the signals that something is simmering beneath the surface. In the Reiner household, these signs were present, subtle yet persistent. They were almost imperceptible to an outsider, but became increasingly pronounced in the weeks leading up to the tragedy. What begins as minor friction can escalate rapidly when emotions, obsessions, and family dynamics collide. And in the case of Nick Reiner, those minor signals would grow into a perfect storm of tension, fear, and ultimately, violence. The escalation began quietly, almost imperceptibly. Nick's behaviors grew more intense, his moods more volatile. Friends and family noted his increasing isolation and moments of strange fixation. Conversations would often veer toward his father, probing, analyzing, testing boundaries. A question here, a comment there, seemingly innocent but layered with a subtle undercurrent of control. To anyone else, these might appear as typical adult curiosity or a young man asserting independence. But to those who observed closely, there was an edge, a tension that was difficult to define yet impossible to ignore once recognized. Rob and Michelle tried to navigate these changes with patience. They were parents, after all, accustomed to the complexities of family life. They had encountered teenage moods, adult frustrations, and the occasional rebellious streak. But the difference here was intensity. Nick's fixation on his father was no longer casual or intermittent. It was consuming, pervasive, and growing more erratic by the day. Instances that might have been dismissed as stress or immaturity were, in fact, manifestations of a deeper, more dangerous psychological pattern. Neighbors occasionally noticed unusual behaviors. Nick would be seen walking the grounds late at night, muttering to himself, pacing near the main house, or lingering outside windows as if observing. These occurrences were inconsistent, brief, and easily rationalized, yet in hindsight, they formed a pattern of mounting tension. The juxtaposition of normal daytime behavior with nighttime disturbances painted a picture of a man increasingly isolated in his mind, preoccupied with thoughts and emotions that were difficult for anyone else to penetrate. Meanwhile, the family dynamic shifted subtly but significantly. Rob and Michelle, despite their awareness, tried to maintain normalcy. They continued their routines, engaged in social events, and appeared composed in public. This effort to preserve equilibrium is common in families under stress. It's a way to protect loved ones from panic, to avoid escalating tension further. Yet normalcy, in this case, could not mask the reality of growing danger. The tension was like a taut wire, vibrating silently until it could no longer be contained. Billy Crystal's warning loomed over these interactions, a ghostly reminder that concern was valid and urgent. Even with this warning, the family's response was constrained by love, denial, and the hope that Nick's behavior was temporary, a phase that would pass. But obsession, once established, rarely diminishes without intervention. The patterns only intensify, gaining momentum until they become impossible to ignore. The escalation took on multiple forms. At times, it was psychological, probing questions, subtle attempts to unsettle Rob, or comments that hinted at dissatisfaction with family dynamics. At other times, it was behavioral, pacing, talking to himself, or exhibiting small, controlled acts meant to provoke attention. Each instance added a layer of tension, building an atmosphere thick with unease, anxiety, and foreboding. Inside the Brentwood estate, every interaction became a potential trigger. Simple requests or casual remarks could spark a disproportionate response. Friends visiting the home occasionally noted the sense of unease, the tension that hung just below the surface. It was subtle but palpable, a feeling that something was amiss, that the family was walking on eggshells, navigating an invisible minefield of mood swings and obsessive attention. It is crucial to understand the psychological context of escalation. Obsession thrives in isolation, fueled by unresolved emotions and reinforced by proximity to the object of fixation. In Nick's case, his close physical and emotional proximity to his parents created a volatile environment. He had constant access to observe, analyze, and manipulate interactions. The more he internalized grievances and unspoken frustrations, the more his behaviors intensified. The warning signs, though increasingly apparent to outsiders, remained difficult for the family to act upon decisively because they were intertwined with love, trust, and hope. As the days progressed, tension began to manifest in more pronounced ways. Small arguments would flare up, quickly diffused, but leaving residual unease. Objects in the home might be slightly misplaced, gestures misinterpreted, glances exchanged with a subtle edge. These microincidents, when aggregated, created a buildup of stress and fear, a psychological pressure cooker. Each moment of interaction added fuel to the fire, unnoticed until it reached a critical point. The media, unaware of the undercurrents within the Reiner family, would later portray the tragedy as sudden, shocking, and incomprehensible. Yet for those who observed closely, the escalation was evident in retrospect. Signs were there: the obsessive behaviors, the mood swings, the unusual patterns of activity, and the warnings from friends like Billy Crystal. The tragedy, then, was not entirely unpredictable. It was the catastrophic culmination of unchecked escalation, subtle warnings ignored, and the complex interplay of love and obsession. Consider the emotional tension within the family. Michelle, ever the nurturing force, likely sensed the underlying strain but may have attributed it to temporary stress or minor conflicts. Rob, balancing the warnings of friends with his parental instincts, may have felt caught between vigilance and hope. This tension, layered over weeks of subtle behavioral escalation, created a situation where the family's capacity to anticipate the danger was compromised, despite awareness of risk. Escalation is often invisible until it reaches a tipping point. The Reiners experienced this in microcosm over weeks, small behaviors magnified by proximity, emotional attachment, and the intensity of Nick's fixation. Each moment added to an invisible accumulation of risk, a pressure building quietly, waiting for release. And when release finally occurred, it would be sudden, brutal, and irreversible. As we move toward the events of the fatal night, it's essential to recognize the trajectory. Escalation did not happen overnight. It was a process, a series of patterns and behaviors that intensified over time. Understanding these dynamics provides insight into both the psychological mechanisms at play and the heartbreaking reality that even love, concern, and warnings can be insufficient when faced with obsession that has reached its critical point. The Reiners' story illustrates the terrifying subtlety of escalation within a family. It shows how obsessive behavior can grow almost imperceptibly, how love can blind, and how proximity can turn nurturing into vulnerability. And as the night approaches when all this tension would explode into tragedy, we must remember, the signs were there. They were visible to those who knew how to look. But no one, not even Rob and Michelle, could have fully prepared for the violence that awaited them. The night of the tragedy began like any other Sunday in Brentwood, yet it would end in unimaginable horror. Picture the Reiner estate, sprawling gardens illuminated by soft outdoor lighting, the warm glow of interior lamps spilling onto polished floors, the faint hum of Los Angeles life beyond the gates. Inside, Rob and Michelle Reiner moved through their evening routines, perhaps chatting about their day, sharing a quiet dinner, or reflecting on plans for the coming week. Their adult son, Nick, was in the guest house, steps away, a presence that had become routine, familiar, and ostensibly safe. But safety, as this night would prove, is often an illusion. No one outside could have predicted the violence that would erupt. To an outsider, the Reiners' life was enviable: fame, fortune, family. Inside, however, subtle tensions had been mounting, behaviors escalating, and warning signs accumulating. Nick's obsession, his fixation on his father, and his simmering internal turmoil had reached a boiling point. By the time the night unfolded, all the carefully maintained facades of normalcy and security would be shattered in an instant. Witnesses later described the house as unusually quiet that evening. Neighbors who would later speak to the press remembered the stillness of the estate, a stark contrast to the chaos that would soon engulf it. The guest house, where Nick resided, was just a few steps from the main home, a proximity that would prove catastrophic. He had lived there for years, seemingly benign, blending seamlessly into the family routine. But living close gave him access, opportunity, and an intimate understanding of the home's layout, the daily habits of his parents, and the ways to exploit the moments when they were most vulnerable. The build-up to the act of violence was silent, invisible to those around the estate. No dramatic confrontations were reported that day. No public outbursts signaled the impending tragedy. To Rob and Michelle, their son's presence likely felt normal, routine even. They could not have known that a culmination of obsession, resentment, and psychological instability was moving closer to them within their own home. When the violence occurred, it was swift and brutal. Rob, 78, and Michelle, 70, were found stabbed to death in their own home. The attack was precise, indicating a degree of premeditation and focus that shocked both law enforcement and the public. The fact that the perpetrator was their own son added a layer of incomprehensible betrayal, an emotional wound that would reverberate through Hollywood, the family, and anyone who had believed in the ideal of familial safety. Nick was arrested at the scene that same night, charged immediately with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The news sent shockwaves through the community. Headlines screamed of the horror, friends and colleagues struggled to comprehend, and the public, glued to the details, tried to reconcile the image of a famous, beloved family with the grotesque reality of the crime. Yet, even amid media coverage, the question that haunted everyone remained. How did it come to this? How did a son, raised with love, access, and support, turn into a murderer in his own home? Psychological experts later offered insights into the factors that likely contributed to the night's events. Obsession, isolation, and unresolved psychological issues can create a pressure that, if left unchecked, can erupt suddenly. The proximity of Nick to his parents gave him both the knowledge and the means to commit the crime. The weeks leading up to the tragedy were marked by escalating behaviors, subtle warning signs, and intervention attempts that, tragically, were insufficient to prevent the catastrophe. Law enforcement reports detail the scene with meticulous care. The guest house, once a space of benign independence for Nick, became central to the investigation. His knowledge of the main house, combined with his intimate understanding of the family's routines, allowed the violence to occur without immediate detection. This proximity underscores a chilling reality. Danger is often closer than we think, sometimes living under the same roof, hidden behind a mask of normalcy. Friends who spoke publicly after the event described disbelief, shock, and sorrow. Billy Crystal, whose warning had been delivered just a week prior, faced the grim reality of his premonition. The weight of his words, once urgent and cautionary, now carried an unbearable heaviness, a reminder of human limitations when confronting unseen darkness. He had tried to intervene, he had tried to warn, and yet, despite his efforts, the outcome remained tragic and irreversible. The media portrayal of the night focused on the brutal details, but those who knew the family recognized the profound betrayal at the heart of the crime. It was not merely a violent act. It was an emotional devastation, the destruction of trust, the annihilation of familial bonds in a single, horrific moment. For Hollywood, for the Reiner's circle of friends, and for the public, it was a lesson in the fragility of perception. The home, once a sanctuary, had become a scene of unthinkable violence. As investigators pieced together the timeline, the meticulousness of the act became apparent. This was not a crime of impulse alone. There were indicators of planning, of psychological preparation, and of an inner logic that only Nick himself could fully understand. The tragedy was a culmination of weeks, months, and perhaps years of escalating behavior, obsession, and tension that finally erupted in a violent crescendo. Yet, even in the horror, there were moments that highlight the human response to catastrophe. Friends and neighbors who discovered the news rushed to the scene. Law enforcement acted swiftly. The community, bound by shared grief, began the painful process of trying to understand what had happened. And amid it all, the question lingered. How did this perfect Hollywood life, so admired, so envied, collapse so completely in a single night? As the night's events unfolded, the juxtaposition of familiarity and violence became haunting. The estate, once a place of warmth, love, and laughter, was now a stage for tragedy. The Reiners, loved and celebrated by many, were gone, victims not only of violence, but of the subtle, creeping escalation that had been ignored, underestimated, or misunderstood. Their son, a presence once perceived as safe and benign, was the source of that devastation. And yet, the story does not end with the night alone. The aftermath, the arrest, the investigation, the media coverage, the reactions of friends and family, would reveal layers of complexity, betrayal, and psychological depth that made the tragedy even more incomprehensible. The fatal night was both an ending and a beginning. The end of life for Rob and Michelle, and the beginning of a public reckoning with the reality of obsession, warning, and familial vulnerability. The arrest of Nick Reiner was swift, precise, and chillingly final. By the time law enforcement arrived at the Brentwood estate, the gravity of the situation had become unmistakable. Rob and Michelle Reiner had been found stabbed to death in their own home, victims of an unimaginable act of violence. The son who had lived in the guest house, steps away from the main house, was identified as the prime suspect almost immediately. What followed that night would send shockwaves through Hollywood, the Reiner family, and the public at large. Nick was apprehended at the scene without incident, a fact that both alarmed and perplexed investigators. While some crimes involve frantic chases or violent confrontations, this arrest was unervingly calm, almost procedural. The young man who had lived alongside his parents, participated in family routines, and presented a facade of normalcy was suddenly, irrefutably, revealed as the perpetrator. The dissonance between the son everyone knew and the man being led away in handcuffs was staggering. From the first moments, investigators were confronted with the shocking proximity of the crime. The guest house, once considered a benign living arrangement for Nick, became central to understanding the tragedy. His access to the main house, his knowledge of his parents' schedules, and his psychological preoccupation with them suggested not impulsive violence, but a deliberate, calculated act. Law enforcement quickly moved to secure the scene, collect evidence, and begin a process that would reveal both the horrific nature of the murders and the complexity of familial betrayal. The arrest also forced the family's friends and the public to confront a grim reality. A child, nurtured and loved, had become a lethal threat. The juxtaposition was impossible to reconcile. Rob and Michelle, figures of warmth, generosity, and acclaim, had been murdered by the very person they had raised, supported, and trusted. The betrayal cut deeper than any act of violence could, compounding grief with a sense of incomprehensible shock. Media coverage exploded almost immediately. Headlines focused on the fame and horror of the event. Hollywood icons murdered in their own home, the son arrested at the scene, and a community struggling to comprehend the enormity of what had happened. Yet beneath the sensational reporting lay the human story, the intimate betrayal, the psychological unraveling, and the tragedy of warning signs that had gone unheeded. Billy Crystal's warning now loomed over the narrative like a shadow. The words he had spoken just a week earlier, "Your son has a dark obsession with you. Watch your back," resonated with haunting clarity. For those outside the family, it was a chilling testament to the difficulty of recognizing danger in someone you love. For Rob and Michelle, the warning could not come too late, but the timing highlighted the cruel precision of fate. Crystal's insight, rooted in experience and intuition, was tragically prophetic. The arrest also triggered an intense legal and psychological scrutiny of Nick. Law enforcement and experts began to piece together not just the timeline of the crime, but the mental and emotional factors that could have contributed to such a violent act. Background checks, interviews with friends, colleagues, and neighbors all painted a portrait of a young man whose outward normalcy masked inner turmoil. The investigation sought to answer questions that few had the ability to ask before the tragedy. When did the obsession begin? What signs had been missed? Could intervention have prevented the crime? Community reactions were immediate and intense. Neighbors described disbelief, horror, and sorrow. Many had known the Reiners from afar, seeing their public personas, but also glimpsing private kindness. The idea that someone so close, so familiar, could commit such an act was beyond comprehension. In homes across Brentwood and beyond, people grappled with a terrifying reality. Violence can come from the most unexpected sources, even within the family. Friends who had known Nick tried to make sense of the arrest. They recounted moments of odd behavior, subtle signs, and conversations that now, in hindsight, appeared to foreshadow the tragedy. These reflections, while valuable, offered little comfort. The weight of shock, betrayal, and grief overshadowed attempts at understanding. The arrest was a stark reminder that human behavior, especially when influenced by obsession, isolation, and unresolved psychological issues, can be unpredictable and devastating. Psychologists analyzing the case emphasize the role of proximity in escalating danger. Nick's access to his parents, his knowledge of their routines, and his ability to observe and manipulate interactions created an environment ripe for tragedy. Obsession, combined with opportunity, produces outcomes that are often sudden, shocking, and irreversible. This understanding, while clinically significant, offered little solace to those mourning the loss of Rob and Michelle. The arrest also catalyzed a public conversation about warning signs, familial boundaries, and the limits of intervention. Friends, family members, and the media debated what could have been done differently. Was the warning from Billy Crystal enough? Could Rob and Michelle have acted sooner or differently? Could mental health interventions have altered the course? These questions would echo in public discourse for months, emphasizing the tension between human intuition and the unpredictability of violent behavior. As the night of the arrest concluded, the Reiner estate transformed from a place of warmth and family into a crime scene, a focal point of grief, and a symbol of the fragility of trust. The son, once an integral part of the household, was now the object of legal scrutiny, psychological evaluation, and public condemnation. The event underscored a tragic reality. Familiarity does not equate to safety, and love, however deep, cannot always shield us from the consequences of obsession and rage. This arrest marked the beginning of a long, painful journey. Investigations, court proceedings, and public reckonings that would expose the psychological, emotional, and social dimensions of the tragedy. It was a moment that forced the world to confront the devastating intersection of family, fame, and the unforeseen darkness that can lurk within someone we love. The morning after the arrest, the Brentwood estate was transformed. Law enforcement vehicles lined the driveway, yellow crime scene tape cordoned off every entrance, and investigators moved with meticulous precision through a home that had been a sanctuary moments before. For the Reiner family, the public, and Hollywood at large, the investigation that followed would uncover both the terrifying reality of the murders and the psychological, emotional, and familial complexities that preceded them. Investigators began by meticulously documenting the scene. Every detail mattered: the placement of objects, the evidence of struggle, the layout of the home, and the proximity of the guest house where Nick had lived. The scene was tragic yet methodical. There were indications of premeditation, careful planning, and knowledge of the house that only someone intimately familiar with the layout could possess. These observations reinforced the conclusion that the act was deliberate, a horrifying escalation of patterns that had been developing for weeks, if not months. Law enforcement also conducted interviews with neighbors, friends, and acquaintances. Neighbors recounted subtle oddities they had noticed: Nick wandering at night, talking to himself, or pacing the grounds. These seemingly minor incidents, almost trivial in isolation, now formed a chilling pattern. Friends noted his fixation on his father, strange obsessions, and moments of erratic behavior that, in hindsight, hinted at a deeper psychological disturbance. These accounts, combined with the crime scene analysis, began to form a mosaic of escalating tension, obsession, and psychological volatility. Psychologists were brought in to assess Nick's mental state, providing insight into how a man raised in love and privilege could commit such an act. Obsession, isolation, and proximity to the objects of fixation, his parents, created conditions ripe for violent behavior. Experts emphasized that Nick's behaviors were not random, but consistent with psychological patterns seen in familial homicides: intense fixation, emotional dysregulation, and a sense of grievance or entitlement that can culminate in lethal violence. Evidence collection extended beyond the physical scene. Investigators scrutinized communication records, social media, and personal journals, searching for clues about Nick's mindset, planning, and potential triggers. Each piece of information added depth to the portrait of a young man whose inner life had become dangerously obsessive. The investigation revealed not just the how, but the why, an insight into psychological escalation that had gone unrecognized, even by those closest to him. Billy Crystal's warning became a focal point of the investigation. Law enforcement noted that just 1 week prior, a trusted friend had voiced concern over Nick's obsession. While not legally actionable, this warning contextualized the crime, highlighting that friends and family had observed troubling behaviors but had lacked the means or clarity to intervene effectively. It was a haunting reminder of the limits of foresight and human intervention in preventing tragedy. The investigators also explored family dynamics in depth. Rob and Michelle's relationship with their son, the household structure, and the presence of the guest house all provided critical context. Proximity had been both a comfort and a risk. Nick had lived close enough to monitor his parents, influence daily routines, and exploit moments of vulnerability. Experts emphasized that such access, combined with obsessive tendencies, dramatically increases the risk of violent escalation. Public reactions to the investigation were intense. Media outlets dissected every available detail, from the Reiner's celebrity status to the psychological aspects of the crime. Headlines screamed of betrayal, horror, and the shocking reality that fame and fortune could not shield a family from tragedy. Meanwhile, friends and colleagues struggled to reconcile the public image of the Reiners with the devastating reality emerging from the investigation. The contrast between perception and reality underscored a harsh truth. Appearances, no matter how flawless, can conceal danger. The investigation also focused on the timeline of the crime. Law enforcement pieced together Nick's movements, examining the hours leading up to the murders, the manner in which he entered the home, and his interactions with his parents. Surveillance footage, witness accounts, and forensic evidence all painted a chillingly precise picture of events. The meticulous nature of the investigation revealed both the horror of the act and the methodical preparation behind it, illustrating the dangerous intersection of obsession, proximity, and opportunity. In addition, investigators worked to understand potential warning signs that had been missed. Nick's behaviors, though subtle at first, had escalated predictably over time. Friends noted minor oddities. Neighbors observed strange nighttime activity. Billy Crystal had issued a clear warning. The investigation underscored the tragic reality that warning signs, even when recognized by outsiders, are often overlooked by those emotionally invested. Love, loyalty, and denial can obscure danger until it reaches a tipping point. The investigation's findings would later inform both the public and psychological experts about the complexities of familial homicide. Patterns of obsession, mental instability, and behavioral escalation were analyzed in detail, providing insight into a tragedy that seemed incomprehensible at first glance. The work of law enforcement, psychologists, and legal experts transformed the crime from a shocking headline into a case study of the dangers that can lurk behind the veneer of normalcy, privilege, and love. As the investigation unfolded, it became increasingly clear that this was not an isolated